performance consist of multidisciplinary protest pieces decked out in draglesque. He's bushy, he's bearded, he's blasphemously blessed. Our next guest is James Knott, an emerging Toronto-based artist. Their performance-based practice combines theater, video, and audio art to create immersive and emotionally resonant experiences, housing personal narratives and queer experiences through poetic retellings, self-mythologizing, and auto-iconographic aestheticism. Lwrds is an interdisciplinary artist that celebrates and centers the liberation of two-spirit, non-binary, queer, trans, intersex, Black, Indigenous, racialized, and invisibilized peoples everywhere. A born storyteller with a deep commitment to healing personal and collective traumas through an intuitive process valuing energetic exchanges with all that exists. Mikiki is a performance and video artist and queer community health activist of Acadian, Mi'kmaq, and Irish descent from Newfoundland, Canada. Their identity as an artist is informed and intrinsically linked to their history as a sexual educator, harm reduction worker, and activist. Mikiki's creative themes often address safety and responsibility, disclosure and self-determination, community building, and reckoning with trauma and loss. And last but not least, Tygr Willy is Boylesque TO's newest Boylesque member, as well as a drag artist part of Houseboat and a drag rent of Tygr House. They've recently performed for the SFU stage as part of Pride TO's Stay Home Saturdays, and is a frequent performer and producer around the city. I'd like to welcome my guests. You're all incredibly fabulous. I can't wait to talk and to have you share your practices with our audience. So let's get started. When Dainty Smith and I started conceptualizing this program, we had a lot of conversations about the queer history of cabaret. Historically, cabaret has been the site of LGBTQ+ celebration and critical discourse. We characterized cabaret as a femme-centered and celebrating space, consistently subverting patriarchal dominance. I'm especially interested in how cabaret is a permissive space, offering both its participants and audiences an open invitation to subvert heteronormative gender identity. I'd like to start by asking each of you to share a bit about your performance practices and the permissions it carves out for both you and your audiences. Why don't we get started with Gay Jesus?
Hello. It's so fun. My name is Gay Jesus. Nice to meet everyone. It feels so strange to hop in without saying hello. So essentially, how has cabaret performance affected my world in performance? For those who don't know me, I'm a drag artist. I do gender bendy drag, and a lot of my drag unintentionally from very, very early on became very political. I have a very heavy interest in politics and in social movements and social change. And I think drag and cabaret allowed for a space where, coming from a theater background, a musical theater and film background, where I had full license over everything I did. And one of the greatest things about that is that I got to have authority in a way over my body in a way that I don't even have socially as a trans person who was socialized as a woman. so much of everything we do, even if it comes from a form of empowerment, is immediately sexualized from a very young age. And being in a cabaret space, being in a drag space, allowed me to play with my body, with sound, with my words, with every single piece of myself in a way that I had full authority over. And that allowed me to then also take my messaging and put it through my art to be able to have those conversations with an audience that also understood a lot of what I was talking about, with an audience that I didn't have to translate for in terms of putting it through a lens that I was not interested in, to be quite honest. We talk a lot about the male gaze when it comes to how female characters are portrayed in media, but that gaze and that lens lends itself within any form of privilege. It goes within whiteness, it goes within being able-bodied, it goes within cis storytelling. And so when I go into a queer space and go into a queer cabaret and I'm able to present my art, I'm able to present it to an audience without it being in relation to straightness, without it being in relation to what is viewed as opposition, because in reality, it's not an opposition. I, as a human, exist as myself, not in opposition to what society has deemed to be decent, you know? And so that really opened up for me the opportunity to find my voice in a very different way and take authority over it in a very different way. And now, through that with my audience, over the years, it's been very, I think the most profound thing for me has been seeing how it's affected audience members that I've connected with over time, seeing how it affects people in a way that is beyond what I would have imagined just like as a human being to have that effect on other people. And then the exchange that happens, because then I get to learn from them, which is, it just makes me cry. But basically, which is for me one of the greatest honors for sure.
Thank you. How about you, James?
Yeah, well, I guess I think that if I remembered the question, that there was kind of like an element of like space making through performance, and like how like um playing with gender and performance, how does that create space for other people or for the audience members that are interpreting that performance, and like with your personal practice. And I remember, because I went to art school, so my background is in fine art. um, and I remember having like a critique sort of like halfway through school, where I the prof was kind of like, she didn't pick up on some of the references that I was putting down, because they were personal narratives. As you know, as you said, as you were reading my bio, a lot of my work is about my life. It's about anecdotes that have shaped who I am and my outlook. And she couldn't pick up on those references, and when that was sort of pointed out, she sort of gave me the critique that like if the work was too personal, nobody would be able to connect to it, which kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But I wasn't in the position of power there. I just sort of like take it and see if that's useful. But that piece ended up getting into a few shows in and around the OCAD community, which was sort of a nice vote of confidence. And then what I found was a lot of people would actually just like stop me on the street as they were crossing from OCAD, or like as I was walking through the halls, because they would see it. And even if they didn't necessarily personally have the same experience as me, it obviously it kind of tugged somewhere. And I think that part of what performing your own experience and sort of being like unabashedly just honest in that way, and naked in that way, it actually creates room for other people to find the pockets of your experience that connect with them. So even if someone is in the audience that isn't trans or non-binary or queer, or who knows what other conglomerate of experiences that I personally had, they might be able to connect to an experience in a way that connects to their identity. So I mean, I've had a piece called Plenty of Fish, which is about my experiences as a queer femme, dating and with sexuality and interpersonal experiences that way. And I've had like Black women come up to me and be like, the experiences that you've had with like men or like straight men are the same experiences I've had with white men. and it's like those are the pockets that people are able to like connect the structure of what's happened to like the identity that they have. And I think that that's been sort of like my power in making work about the self, kind of selfishly that way, is being more generous in a sense.
Thank you. Lwrds, can you share with us about the permissions that you give yourself and that you give your audience?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Well, once James started talking about, coming from an art school background because we graduated from the same program, I immediately started thinking about, wait, when was the first time that I was really consciously aware about making work that very much forced me to really critically look at my gender, my sexuality, and my own experience of being intersex within everything, right? Within like cis heteronormativity and colonization. So it was actually when I was still in graphic design, I switched from design to art. And so it was in that looking at critical design and just the responsibilities of designers in how we communicate ideas and what ideas we choose to communicate. And I started doing a piece on speculative design of some kind of pharmaceutical that would allow, whoa, something just fell. That would allow for people to have the freedom to change their hormonal composition as they wish. And so exploring that, and it became the thing that just blew everything right open, as I had to not only have that level of honesty and acceptance within myself, because I never felt shame around who I am. And yet we internalize these things and the shame in many different ways that aren't, like, nothing is a binary again, not sex, not gender, not anything that exists in the universe. And so questioning this was what allowed me to start thinking about how do I present myself to others and even to myself, like how do I accept my body and the way that I use my body within my work. So I started doing performance work in graphic design, and then I decided to switch over to fine art so that I could really just go full all the way in to my own craziness, like as a neurodivergent person, and I just wanted to be able to do whatever. And in that, looking back, just in the way that I identified my own gender and my sex, my sexuality, and even my body, there's been so many changes. And it feels like really was only like about in the span of 5 years or so. And that being able to share that with others, with the work, a lot of my work relies on me using my body. And either it was presence before COVID time or now through video or photography performance, I can see how I have grown and shifted and changed, and how much of that is influenced by the communities that I'm surrounded by and the kind of research that I'm interested in. And yeah, so I just went through some kind of tangent, but yes, body, sex binary and real.
Thank you. I'd like to touch on this relationship between, performance art and fine art versus the cabaret performance, and, what some of the differences are. But before we do, let's hear from Mikiki. Would you like to describe how you give yourself permission in performance and what kinds of permissions you give your audience?
Sure. I started doing performance. I didn't consider it performance work. I started doing activist stuff that was just not really, or like that was within the context of me being a rowdy, punk fag in Newfoundland and a teenager, So like doing body image workshops for the punk rock music festival that happened every summer, like in my underwear with a couple of friends in the middle of the park to talk about our bodies and try and normalize our relationship to our bodies. And drag kind of just started as an exploration, and also seeing that there were seeing that other people had kind of taken that permission and taken their own autonomy, into their hands around how they presented, and seeing that as a really sacred thing. I guess one kind of last thing about that was that I was part of this activist group called Youth for Social Justice in St. John's, and we had a group that was forming called Puppets for Change, and they brought in this group from South Africa called Puppets Against AIDS to kind of teach puppetry workshops. And I was too lazy to make puppets, so I didn't want to be a part of that group. But I remember sitting in on these workshops and having these amazing activists from South Africa talking about how HIV and AIDS was so stigmatized in their home communities that they couldn't do kind of political theater as themselves, because then they would be marked as, as they care about HIV, so they must be HIV positive. And they talked about using puppets, or I kind of extrapolated as to like using character, or just creating a false image or a different image of myself as a way to talk about some of the issues that I thought were a little bit too treacherous for me to take on as whatever boyish version of myself that I took on. So it became a way to create a safe space for me to talk about things that I was otherwise too afraid to.
Thank you. And Tygr Willy, can you share with us about your performance practice and the permissions that it utilizes?
Sure. Sorry. Yes, I have practices. I'm sorry. I'm soaking in everything that everyone said, and I have so many things that I want to throw in. I came to burlesque first, I think, before I came into like drag and gender performance, because I wanted to love my body, and my whole arts practice is about trying to be an example for other Indigenous or Asian or mixed race humans to see themselves in me, in the hopes that they can do whatever it is that they want to do. And so the journey of like, it's that you mentioning self-worship at the very beginning has like stuck with me a lot, because that seems like such a juicy curiosity that I now want to explore. But I think it's the idea for me, and the practice and the reminder I do this because I just want to liberate myself. And I do this because I want to liberate other people who share similar identities with me and who are marginalized. And so now my practice has become sometimes drag, sometimes burlesque, sometimes strange performance art, sometimes very sad political spoken word tied to my various communities. Yeah.
Wonderful. I can only credit the term self-worship in relation to burlesque and cabaret to Dainty Smith, who oftentimes talks about the cabaret stage as a place of worship and a place of self-worship, something that sort of a place where we carve out possibilities for self-love and for loving and desiring others. And we'll talk a little bit more about how seduction falls into the cabaret experience. But a few of you brought up this relationship between fine art or performance art and sort of more cabaret stage. And I'm just hoping that we can elaborate on that conversation a little bit. When I entered the cabaret world it was in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it was very white and hetero when I originally sort of began going to cabaret shows. But it wasn't really until I started going to queer and trans BIPOC-centered cabaret that I really began to understand these types of performances as performance art, as doing the same thing that happens in performance art, which is oftentimes critical, political, and oftentimes based around framing, certain gestures as having specific relationships and connotations. And I'm wondering if any of you want to speak to the relationship, either as a divide or as a shared space between performance art and cabaret, because I feel like some of you have definitely performed in gallery institutional type spaces, as well as in the more traditional cabaret stage type space.
No one wants to tackle that first. Well, I guess I'm gonna get my hands dirty. No, I guess. Well, Golboo, you started to sort of talk about how you weren't starting to see these connections until you were coming to places that were explicitly like BIPOC and queer centered, where you were starting to see those connections that were being tied. And it reminds me of when I teach like performance art lectures of sort of like the origins of performance art. And I take it back to this article that I had read in first year when I was learning about performance art. And I think it's called Suffragettes Invented Performance. That might not be the title, but it sort of has this kind of like pseudo 10 commandments of performance art. And it's like kind of serious, kind of not serious. And one of them is that like performance artists are always like a Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer, not straight, not cis, all of the identities here and there. And that sort of speaks to sort of the ethos that like when performance art emerged, it was because it was not so much like an art form that like you decided, you had a vocation to do. It was like that was the only thing that like you literally could do. You were like carving out a space. And so naturally, like I feel like if as that kind of like lost its original what's the word? I guess worldview as it sort of became commodified in and of itself, and it bought into the powers that be in the larger fine arts world. Naturally, these identities that are still fighting for themselves would have to pivot to like creating and carving another space, and I can totally see that as being underground cabaret, because again it's like once burlesque stops being dirty and it becomes something that like you and your husband can go to on like Sunday and like feel cultured. It's like like clearly the people that are still undesirable that want to participate in those spaces are gonna congregate in the nice creeks and alleys of the city and kind of synthesize all of these attempts at like trying to belong and then sort of being forced out. I'm probably not making sense anymore, so I'm gonna eschew my time.
Would anyone else like to add to that?
Well, yeah, like I feel like the shared space and just the origins, like it's all there's so much one and the other are the same, and yet because of fine art and what capital white institution, it's just depending, I guess. I keep thinking about all of the times that I would be asked to explain what was the difference between what I was doing, what they were seeing, versus cabaret, versus burlesque, versus anything else. And so that was always very like a frustrating thing for me, because for me, it's all one and the same, like the work that I do, because of who I am and because of what my body represents in any art space, whatever work it is that I am making, then it's always going to be outside. But respectability politics just keep creeping in and say, well, if you're doing this kind of work that isn't, if I guess some like cis white dude usually can take what you do and it doesn't cross their idea of the line of respectability, then it's performance art. And if it is too sexual, too seductive, like whatever, it's just something, if it's trying to turn you on according to the viewer, then it's no longer art. It's no longer performance art. Now it's sex work, and that is bad. So it's a mess. It is a mess. And in my practice, I do not like that difference, and I am pro-ho 1,000%. And sex work is work, and sex workers need money, money, money. So no, fuck it. I don't need like a difference between, oh no, the kind of work that I do, it's not like those hoes. I'm like, no, I am those hoes, and it's okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Lwrds, that was great. I totally 100% agree. And I find it so, I find it interesting because I had never considered, my drag work as a part of my artistic practice. And because most of it was, it started off as hosting benefit shows and doing workshops, and kind of came out of, it was only as I stopped, as these incredible feminist instructors that I had kind of taught me that there are these incredible histories from Black and brown artists and queer artists and Indigenous artists that are about resisting the commodification of art making. And that also kind of like talks about the history of performance and video art and social practice. And when I started situating my, I just started putting more of my life into my identity as an artist. And I think that made space for all of who I was, as opposed to, I do drag on the side and I do weird activist stuff that sometimes is in drag. And it also was like, there was an interesting consideration, kind of similar or not dissimilary to this, where I had a partner of, a number of years who was an artist as well. And he said, he's like, I think you need to find a regular way to access drag and gender exploration for yourself, because now every performance that you do is drag performance. And I am wondering if that is because that seems to be the only place that you are carving out for yourself to do this work. And I was like, well, fuck you, you're right. So it was interesting for me to then have to think about, well, what is, is my drag work all my performance work? Is that inherently about my performance practice? And I don't know that is either.
Thank you for sharing that, Mikiki. Yeah, I think that it's an interesting conversation because there's so much from cabaret that is appropriated and brought into art, fashion, the performance art world. And as we see sort of what happens in cabaret become more mainstream, it's not necessarily with the same cultural capital that is afforded, fine artists that are supported through, let's say, grants and institutions and so on. And so a lot of the conversations that Dainty and I have around the divide between cabaret and performance art really has to do with the access and entry points to resources that are available to the artists, the fine arts community that isn't necessarily available to cabaret performers, and how we can actually address the discrepancy, especially since the work is critical creative work. And so where, how can we push for cabaret performers to be recognized as artists by, let's say, the granting bodies, so that their practice can also be sustained as performers? Okay, I'm just going to switch gears a little bit and talk about seduction. In the art of cabaret, seduction is the medium. The word seduction has always meant, and I got this from like etymology.com, has always meant to lead astray and to corrupt, which I found incredibly interesting. The body becomes the site of alternative corporeal narratives. Unapologetically rebellious, cabaret performers take up space, commanding visibility and confronting assumptions, all while urging the negotiation of our desires internally and externally. The cabaret performer doesn't subscribe to the classic role of the passive nude a la fine art. Rather, they're empowered and emboldened, enticing the audience to misbehave with them. Writer and historian Shane Vogel describes cabaret as, quote, a powerful symbol of the pleasure and danger of urban life, where intimate interactions between performer and spectators, illicit alcohol consumption, social dancing, potential for interracial contact, public displays of sexuality, and underworld connotations exist. Shane Vogel wrote this specifically about the Harlem cabaret scene. I'm curious to know how each of you use seduction in your performance, and who you're leading astray. Let's start with Tygr.
I'm leading men astray and hopefully dismantling and destroying them. That's the goal. And then the appetizer and the dessert and all of the bounty and abundance that I hope folks get from that audience is my QT BIPOC and trans community. So destroying men and uplifting everyone else. It's so funny, seduction, because I've always been, even before I was Tygr Willy, I was named as like a very like sexual and sexy and seducing kind of person. And I just think that's just because people are projecting what they want onto me, and what I'm delivering is what they just want. Is what they would want in their day-to-day. It's what they want in their intimacy. Yeah, because a lot of people, like, I'm not a comedy person, as an example. I struggle with comedy. I say that because oftentimes when I'm experiencing cabaret, whether it's in drag or burlesque or what have you, there's like the binary of like comedy and like sexy, and then sometimes they play and interact with each other. But a lot of people will be like, Tygr, you're so sexy, you're so sexual. And I'm like, am I? Or am I just liberated in my body and you're craving that? And then you're also craving that out of all of your intimate relationships. So that's what I'm going to offer with that.
Absolutely. I love that answer. Mikiki, what's your take on seduction?
Sure. I find this question so funny and so fascinating. I mean, I'm a slut, you know. I identified as a slut since I was 16, and I found this Sluts for Social Justice pin at the black market in Halifax and put it on my backpack. And you know, like, I worked hard to get HIV, and I think that's like, I guess I push the grotesque and the abject and aspects of my corporeal existence into my cabaret work, because it's all bloody and it's usually half dressed and not a full look, you know. there's always things that are not complete, because I like the illusion falling apart. I think that's a way more interesting. That's a way more interesting avenue. A way more interesting. That's my lane, I guess. You know, like she can't really finish anything, so why not stick with that? But I do think that to kind of echo some of or like Tygr Willy's answer too. Like I think that I really like the idea of seducing and connecting and bringing up the experiences of the fuck ups and like people that are kind of seen as irresponsible and people that are seen as undesirable, like that, bringing my my reality into that space in a messy way, I think helps to kind of validate the other messy queens in the room.
There's something so wonderfully messy about cabaret, and I didn't even realize it until I was given the pleasure of going backstage. And then I realized what happens so glamorously on, on the stage, and what we see as an audience, which is like glitter and glamour and this amazing, performance, is literally taped and strapped together with like duct tape and, like you mentioned earlier, Mikiki, crazy glue and so on. And it's so funny that like I would have never guessed how messy being a cabaret performer really is, how many safety pins and strips of duct tape it takes to be a cabaret performer. And I kind of love that about that experience. Lwrds, did you want to share about seduction?
Seduction. I think I often, whenever I think about the idea of seduction, or maybe even the word itself, to me has so many connotations with femininity, not because there is just a soul new relationship between that, but also because growing up and as someone who was assigned female at birth, and also a brown body, I immediately was over sexualized from an early age. And so I remember very well that how often my mannerisms were always considered to be, like hyper feminine. So you'll be told, oh, you're wonderful, you're so hyper, you're so feminine, so delicate. And I couldn't feel a connection to that, like in that way of like this idea of like womanhood, right? Because to me, this thing that they would oversimplify as femininity was just my gayness, but it wouldn't be read as that. And so not only was I read as being so feminine, but also so sexual. Anything that I would be doing would be sexual. Like I'm eating a fucking fruit, it's so sexual. I'm like, and a lot of times, yeah, I will play with it because sexual energy is a place where I go, and the erotic energy is where I draw so much from, right? And like I draw from it. But when like those ways that people talk about seduction and femininity and this and it is always about like, it's about leading someone astray, somewhere bad, dark. It's like it positions you as a bad actor, right? You are just trouble. And that is, again, something that would be told constantly. You're just trouble. Just by existing and exuding so much sexuality. And I'll be just like, well, you all want me that makes you all gay. Like, it's not, it's not on me that I confused you sexually, right? And so, yeah, I think about Audre Lorde, and she talks about the uses of the erotic, right? So that's something that I go back to a lot. And what I like about performing is being able to channel that erotic energy, just to open up that collective connection between my erotic energy and everyone else's sexual, non-sexual energy, because it's what charges me in so many ways. It's like glow in the dark kind of thing. Like, I just want to suck it all in energetically, and through osmosis. And it's, again, yeah, like many of you were saying, it's projections. People are projecting their own stuff, and I'm like, you project all you want. I will take it out of you and just make something else with it.
Thank you. James, would you like to talk to us about seduction?
I would like to talk about seduction, but I feel like we haven't heard enough from our divine Lord, Gay Jesus. So if you would like to speak before me, I could pass it on, because I've spoken twice already. I mean, and I'd love to speak more, and I will, about this topic. But
Speak first. I want to hear it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm listening. I'm just sitting, soaking you all in, obsessed.
Please suck me in. Yeah. So seduction, I guess it's like, I've been obsessed with desire as a concept for a while, and not just sort of like my desirability, but also like the things that I desire. And I've kind of I've been developing this kind of like side project alter ego life where like I have like a fake Instagram that kind of just started because like straight guys just wanted to get nudes from me without like the world knowing, and I was like, okay, great, now I gotta have another thing. And then I was like, you know what, I have all these nudes, like I basically called them my starter pack. So I was like, I might as well just start posting them, because I was posting them to my story anyways. So like I almost have this like kind of like alter ego character, and I almost look at it as like kind of like advertisements for this person. Like I almost don't even see it as me anymore. And all social media is a projection. Like even like me right now, is I'm existing as a projection. So I kind of like play into that of like how does one market themselves as the product of desirability? Like, because especially if we talk about like the economics of like dating through Tinder, it's like it's not, it is a projection, and it's become so like mechanical and rote, which I don't think is necessarily a problem, but like I feel like most people have become acclimatized to treating themselves and others as like the product of desire, and like how do you buy into that desire? And so I think that's sort of like where seduction is coming from me, is like I've been very interested in like the archetypes of like the archetypal feminine desire, and like what does that look like, and like who are these people that like we've always been obsessed with, and like how do I buy into that, and how do I tarnish that? I think that's kind of also maybe the seduction for me, the sort of tarnishing of it isn't so much bringing someone to the dark side, which like I will do on a Wednesday night, but also like tarnishing myself of like how do I make this a little ugly, a little sexy ugly. And I've also been interested in like character archetypes of like the succubus or the nymph, or like characters that like femme characters that exist just as desire, as objects of desire, like they don't have any other characteristics or powers outside of just being objects of desire. And I think that's really interesting, and maybe kind of like naive to want to play with, but I think that's maybe something that might be a healthy exercise for most people to kind of try, as like how do you see yourself interacting with desire and desirability? Like what is the negotiation that you're putting forward? Because everything in life is a negotiation, including desirability. And
Yeah, thank you. And let's hear from our Savior, Lord and Savior, Gay Jesus.
Hey. For me, the thing that I find really interesting is the assumption of seduction as someone who like the way that I've grown up because of either the way I was born, the intersections I live at, etc. I've experienced fetishization from a number of different angles at different points in time throughout my life. And so as someone who's like a very private person, seduction for me is like a very complicated thing because it's not something that I inherently want to experience with an entire audience of people, though I prance around in my underwear. And so the first time I ever took my clothes off on stage was because I was doing a performance. It was my first like protest performance, and I didn't know that anything would ever come of it, but I knew that I needed to make it because I had people's attention for 5 minutes, and I was like, "You're gonna listen to me." And then I realized that some people would leave, and I was happy knowing that if they chose to leave because they didn't like what I had to say, that it's because they already heard it and then they chose to go. But then I was like, how can I make them stay? And I remembered Lady Gaga would say that she used to play cabaret rooms and people wouldn't listen to her music, so she took off her clothes and played in her underwear, and then they listened. So I was like, great, I'll just take off my clothes, and then you have to listen to my politics because you're like, ooh, they're naked. And then I'm like, surprise. So that's how it started for me. And then that began to introduce me into the world of burlesque. And so when I started to play with my performances, a lot of it became finding how to bring different forms of intimacy into a performance in a way that taps into seduction and desire, but in a way that gives the audience the option to choose it or not. And finding other forms of intimacy. And that, like, I asked myself, I could, go on stage and like twirl my pasties and like take off my clothes and like play with a bow, which is something I admire from other people. But similar to how when I perform drag, how it has to be specific to how I experience gender, I was like, what is burlesque for me? What is seduction for me? And sometimes it's a conversation, and sometimes it's silence, and sometimes it's touch, and sometimes it's a lack of touch. And so bringing that personal element into performance and using that as an offering for an audience to also give them the option of knowing that they can not only choose to not interact with it, but if they want to potentially discover new forms of intimacy that they might not always be offered in our mainstream pop culture.
Yeah. Everything that everyone said is incredibly, right on. I feel like it really touches on the complexity and the nuances of seduction. When in my conversations with Dainty Smith, Dainty oftentimes says that seduction is the ability to capture someone's attention on your own terms as a performer. That once, and many of you have said this, that once you've captivated the attention of your audience, then you can really tell any story. And as someone who's sat in the audience of many cabaret shows, when it comes to queerness and gender fluidity and gender performance, there's very often times where you hear members of the audience almost vocalize their thought process of trying to make sense of what they're seeing on stage, because it's challenging them on so many different levels. And I think that is the magic of QT BIPOC performance, is that it really does challenge so many assumptions. And when we can't quite tell, who we're looking at, when we can't, mark things off in a very clean, way, it becomes this messy place where we are forced to reckon with our own assumptions, where we're forced to ask ourselves, what are our assumptions? And besides our assumptions, what is this feeling that we're feeling in this moment? I'm going to share an anecdote. I remember being at one of your performances, Gay Jesus, and there were a couple, it was kind of at a venue that wasn't very queer, but there was a couple men who were standing in the audience, and while next to me, and while you were performing, one person said to the other, you know, is that a man or a woman? And their friend responded by saying, it doesn't matter, take it in, it's hot. And I, you know, for me, that moment was so special because, you know, everything that was happening in that moment was challenging this person. And they were being challenged because they were also being seduced. They were also totally, you know, captivated in that performance. And again, it's these moments in cabaret, specifically QT BIPOC cabaret, that I find that these challenges come up for audience members who walk in thinking it's going to be an experience that they, you know, that is predictable, and then having all of those assumptions sort of broken down along the way. The great thing about cabaret, I find, is the call and response of performers and audiences, you know, unlike performance art, which happens in a gallery or an institutionalized space, often the audience is lively and incredibly interactive in cabaret. There's screaming and shouting and hooting and hollering, and that's part of the space, is that, you know, that the audience gives back and is in you know, in IRL very much responding to everything that's happening on stage. And I love that about cabaret. I find it to be, you know, pretty different from how we generally experience performance art. And it, you know, it produces an interactive experience. It produces an experience where the audience knows that they're part of the show, where they know that their response is part of the entire experience of the work. Anyone want?
Would it be okay for me to also share an anecdote that kind of relates to what you're speaking of?
Absolutely.
I was really blessed to be asked to be one of three programmers for the Resistance and Raunch Cabaret that happened at Buddies in Bad Times. I think it was 2013, and I was programming this amazing cabaret with Kim Katrin Milan and Vivek Shraya, and we programmed this incredible performer, a friend of mine, Devo, who now lives in Vancouver. Their act used to be called Ghost Taco, and now it's called Pelvic Space. But essentially, the act of Pelvic Space is that Devo inserts a small microphone into their vagina and then plays distortion pedals and occasionally kind of will sing along or vocalize. And it people were not picking it up as it was being put down, let's say. Until there was this, like, people with, like, everyone got silent and we were like, oh, okay. I was like, oh, my poor friend. And then there was this moment where someone in the audience said, oh my God, I can hear her heartbeat. And then a collective gasp. And then you felt everyone move forward. And it was this, like, electric experience of visiting someone's body as a sonic event that I had never, like, it's one thing, I'd been a fan of their work. I'd listened to the, you know, like, their noise performances on Bandcamp, but it was, you know, it's a totally different thing to have that interaction with the audience and to be able to feel that collective movement forward with a room full of people. It was incredible.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. I mean, you know, cabaret is about our relationship to the body, our bodies and other folks' bodies, in this, like, very charged space, in this space where we're arriving knowing that it's going to be charged, in this, like, corporeal way, in this way that is absolutely implicating our bodies. Yeah, is there anybody else who wants to share an anecdote or a thought?
I have a thought. I feel like I feel like cabaret for time, and especially presently, is offering the ability for audiences outside of cabaret to not be passive. And so I get bored by audiences when I'm among audiences, when they choose to just like keep it to themselves. I remember a couple of years ago being in the youth program at Buddies in Bad Times, and Lily Davis was the youth coordinator there, and they were talking to us, and then everyone was silent, and they sat back and they were like, "I'm not TV." And I remember being like, yes, anything that gets to live is active and alive. And if you choose to be an audience member in any live situation, whether it's in a hoity-toity gallery space or whether you're in like a dark dive bar, by entering that space, you are choosing to be active in it. And I just feel like I crave so much for people to not disrespect or interrupt, but to be vocally and actively present with us, like in the same way that we are with them. I crave that so much, all the time, regardless of what's going on in your life. I want it. That's what I want.
Yeah, I feel like, in this time of COVID, one of the things that's really shifted for burlesque performers, because I feel like the burlesque community actually very quickly shifted online as a means of survival. That's one of the things that was sort of like lost, is this live audience feeling. The best part about watching cabaret online is the chat room, and like how after every performance, everybody turns their mics on, everybody hoots and hollers, and then gives their messages of affirmation, and then all the mics turn off again and we watch the next number. And I find, again, like, it is so much a part of cabaret to have a lively and interactive audience, that even when the performer is seemingly performing to the internet abyss out there, that there is still this compulsion on the part of the audience to respond, to be alive and lively, to give the performer the very thing that they would have gotten from a real life audience space, a real life theater space. And I find that cabaret is shape-shifting. Like, the ability for these types of performances to move online so quickly, the ingenuity on the part of the community to find a way to make it happen, has been remarkable. I can say that I know for a fact that the community has lost many job opportunities, a lot of revenue, a lot of possibilities, and yet there's, like, as a community, the burlesque community is consistently fundraising for other initiatives outside of their own community, constantly working. It's incredible to see how involved the cabaret community and their audiences are, even in times that become incredibly challenging for being able to put the work out there in its more traditional format. Yeah. Yes.
I was like, I'll raise my hand like we're in school. I think it's also really important to remember so many of these spaces are able to be vocal and able to be active because when we look at spaces outside of that are deemed like non-cabaret or whatever, or like highbrow, it's because to be quiet is inherently this like Anglo-white thing. And it's this active and like maybe not intentional, but like very much intentional active silencing. And I think that the way that our cabaret spaces celebrate voice, celebrate community, makes even performance a community event in that it is like interactive and the voice of the audience is as important as the voice of the performer. And then when it comes to transferring online, for the queer community, this isn't our first pandemic. And so seeing the way that our elders have passed down teachings of survival and teachings of how to adapt, I think is really wonderful, and seeing how that comes into play. Whenever I log onto my social media, I was terrified at first because I was like, what am I going to see? And everyone on my Facebook was like, hey, if anyone's hungry, I'm dropping off some food. Like, if anyone needs anything, like, do you need a ride anywhere? Does anyone just want a walking buddy? And I realized, oh, the impact of our community is so much greater than just, you know, like how we were able to come together before. It is very much based in community care and survival, not only, but finding ways to thrive with one another. And then when it comes to transferring to social media, I think something that's really important for people to remember is, with the ways that laws are targeting and actively targeting sex workers, that bleeds into all sorts of different industries. And I think that understanding the way that these nudity laws and whatnot affect burlesque performers and whatnot, we need to also remember, being within the community, that this hierarchy that society has deemed, when we talk about, you know, fine art versus cabaret, but then it's also within cabaret, this hierarchy of like, oh, like it's burlesque, but it's art, but then it's not sex work. You know what Lwrds has said before about respectability politics is, as a community, we also have to remember our history of where burlesque stems from, and also work actively to fight for the rights of sex workers that are currently losing a lot of their rights, even just within the past week, have taken a huge financial impact. And so it's also remembering like why we're able to function the ways we do, and that even within our industry, that this respectability politics exists, and that if we're going to exist as an entity in a community that works to challenge the norms, then we also have to do it in a way that uplifts the reason why we exist, which comes from sex work. So I think that's a really important thing to remember as well when we think of the ability to work online. A huge part of, you know, our community, and even a community that is very much tethered to us, is currently losing their ability to work online. And especially in the midst of this pandemic, I think that's something we really need to remember and fight against.
Absolutely. I actually would love to hear everyone speak on that. You know, in 2018, there was the FOSTA and SESTA laws that were passed that censored digital content, pretty much all digital content that was deemed of a sexual nature, you know, under this idea that they were, you know, protecting folks from sex trafficking and specifically non-consensual and child sex trafficking. But FOSTA and SESTA laws actually, you know, they shut down the Craigslist personal ads. There were a number of different sort of like repercussions that happened for sex workers or sex positive workers. I'm interested to, and now more recently with Facebook and Instagram, literally shadow banning permanently folks that they deem, you know, to be inappropriate, posting inappropriate content. And we know that there's inappropriate content all over these social media platforms, or of, you know, inappropriate as in of a sexual nature. But there's definitely certain communities that are being targeted and that are making it clear that they're being targeted and shadow banned. Can any of you speak to the more recent restrictions placed on independent digital distribution for sex positive performers and sex workers? I do think that, you know, it is an incredibly important conversation about sustainability, quite frankly, specifically, you know, for what is oftentimes considered a marginal community. Yeah. Not.
I'll go. Try.
Sure.
Let's try. I'm gonna. It's, oh my goodness. Well, one, I know that my career in this 2020 year as an online burlesque performer is entirely owed to sex workers, especially as someone who used to be more explicitly a sex worker, comparable to this burlesque, the divide of burlesque and sex work that sometimes happens. But this is something that censorship is not new to our community. Not to say that it's right at all, and that we must fight and we must support everyone. But it's what I'm noticing about this is that it feels. I'm gonna say something bold. It feels like we are at the beginning we are at the beginning of the end of Instagram and Facebook, because wherever sex workers go and the liberation of sexuality and the liberation of gender, wherever it goes online, the queer community for sure will follow, but so does everyone else eventually. And the more that we limit that, the more there becomes a new craving to find a new platform to use so that we can be liberated. Like we witnessed it with MySpace, we witnessed it with Tumblr, we're now witnessing it with Instagram and Facebook. And so I just wanted to offer that, like, I wanted to offer a moment of hope that I feel like we're witnessing the end of. We're watching Instagram and Facebook fall by choosing to be so ignorant and inaccessible to sex workers, specifically because sex workers really do serve everyone who has sexual cravings. And so for me, it's a curious moment where I'm taking note. I'm like, cool, I now need to provide more support to all of my sex worker kin, as well as also being like, now we need to start creating new spaces, because we're especially in this unprecedented year, we are in the era of everything that we know to be true can be instantly demolished. And that's for sure, there's a lot of hardship that comes with that, but I'm trying to offer myself out of the moment by being like, we're in the dawning of a new era of it, and I'm excited to see where it goes, but I'm not sure where it's going to live right now. I do know for myself, I've backed up everything that I've posted on Instagram and Facebook, because I'm gearing up to switch gears come the 20th, because I know that that's when it comes into effect. I'm also gearing up to not be on social media on the 20th in support of sex workers and in support of trying to send a big message to Zuckerberg and his platform.
Thank you. Do you want to just elaborate a little bit on what's happening amongst the sex worker community on the 20th? I think it's important.
Yes, this is what I know, and so please, if anyone has anything else, please jump onto what I'm saying. But I know that on January 20th, Instagram is doing they're already doing it with shadow banning, as you mentioned, but they're doing their big purging of many content, from emojis that have a sexual nature, like eggplants, peaches, what have you, to showing your butt, and to specific individuals showing their butts. Because as I feel like many of us know, sometimes we'll see many men showing their butt and their content never gets flagged, but then we will see trans folks and women who are trying to make a living, and then they get shadow banned, or they get blocked, or their posts get flagged for various reasons, or there's rude comments. So that's what I know of what's happening on the 20th. And so then in what I know of the invitation that I've been witnessing is that when this effect comes in for us, similar, I feel, to what happened with Tumblr, where when the Tumblr happened, everyone left, and then Tumblr kind of struggled. I feel like this day of silence, and hopefully it'll only catalyst things further. That there will be a day where we're not on these social media platforms in support of sex workers who don't get to, and queer community for that matter, who don't get to use copy or photography or videography or content to thrive.
Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else want to speak on the topic?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of that, because for some reason earlier in the week, I think my parents had mentioned Al Capone, and I was thinking about prohibition, like the prohibition era, and then all of this that's been happening, you know, especially with Instagram, also with what happened at Pornhub earlier in the week. It's very reminiscent of, to me, like the fact that like everyone is engaging in this behavior, and then because, you know, there is sort of a larger societal connotation towards the dangers of that behavior, that, you know, will take it away from the people. But kind of like what Ty said, it'll just migrate into different spaces. And, you know, as we were talking about things like underground cabaret and queer BIPOC spaces, not to say that like that is a preferable scenario, and that like you kind of have to like go to like the cracks of society and like fester in different places, and it's harder to, you know, get your work seen, and it's harder to get into spaces of like places that you'd be interested in. After, you know, the Tumblr thing happened, I became, not that I was really on Tumblr, but I had to sort of, you know, search for, a lot of people had migrated to Twitter, and like Twitter has almost become like my like go-to porn source. And then, you know, especially also in like the wave of like Pornhub, I'm like, okay, well, it's like, you know, Instagram's going to be deleted, everyone's going to go to Twitter, then, you know, the pressure is going to be on Twitter to leave, and it's like, where am I going to get my jollies, girl? Where am I going to get my jollies? So I don't know, but it's like, I think hopefully, you know, like we used the word catalyst earlier, that like the error of these ways will be seen, if hopefully not in like the 12 years that it took for prohibition to be turned around. But you know, hopefully there will be like a chillaxing, because it's like, again, it's almost like, it's not even just like the offensive like annexation of like sex positivity or sex work, but like the fact that like an emoji of a peach, which like, yes, obviously like is being used as a euphemism, not like with any embarrassment or shame at all, but it's also a peach. Like people are gonna, you know, use the peach. Or like this is maybe a little bit more egregious, but I saw a picture yesterday on Instagram from a famous drag queen looking fabulous, and I wanted to comment "bitch" with like some emoji, and then I pressed post, and then Instagram was like, do you want to think about that? This doesn't look like something that you might want to post. And I was like, girl, I'm not gonna get like flagged and like deleted just because I wrote bitch to another queer performer. No, thank you. So I deleted that, or I edited it. But I was like, this is too much. So some of these teens out here are ruthless, but this is too much. So I don't know. I'm also hopeful, but there's going to be a period of suckage, not the nice kind, the straight boy kind, where they use too much teeth.
There's this interesting, you know, when COVID happened, there was this interesting relationship between, or that I noticed, between celebrities taking up space on, let's say, OnlyFans, and at the same time as like sex workers being shut down online. And of course, celebrities who have an incredible following taking up space on OnlyFans is incredibly problematic for the folks who were on OnlyFans prior to celebrities jumping on board, but also don't have the kind of following that celebrities have. And it isn't the celebrities that are shadow banned for showing body parts or making, you know, sexy comments or so on. It really is the most marginalized communities already, who are already doing sex work through various platforms. And I wonder, as performers, how you navigate that kind of a relationship where, you know, the industry is being appropriated by mainstream, literally at the cost of the freedom to be able to do the work that you do. I know that for a while, the cabaret community moved over to Twitch, and then Twitch started banning shows. They've moved to other platforms that are not as stable, or have been, you know, blocked or banned, or had their shows shut down on other platforms as well. So it becomes this huge task just to find a virtual space to do the work that you've been doing for years in various different spaces. I also find that there tends to be a season for this kind of work where it's like, as we get closer to Pride, you know, people loosen up about, you know, their regulations and, you know, what is deemed, you know, viable and legitimate and not. And then as soon as we sort of like move a little bit away from Pride, things go under lockdown again. And I just sort of want to hear you folks speak to the potential appropriation and commodification of the work that you do outside of your autonomy. Because what I saw about cabaret that was incredibly magical was that folks had autonomy over the business of their bodies and how they perform, over the business of their performing. Whereas now there's this strange appropriation that's happening from folks outside of the community. And it's literally taking away from folks who've been part of the community and giving back to the community. I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Could I chime in?
Sure.
It's the I'm glad to hear people are hopeful. I'm not hopeful. I get infuriated by the avenues that we are given are always already corporatized and already about monetizing, and they are already set up with algorithms for people who have migrated over from other platforms that already have, you know, by virtue of their level of access, you know, like large followers and the capital that comes with that. So seeing the spaces that we have historically been able to at least moderately express ourselves in, or advertise that we will be expressing ourselves in, you know, in our fullness and our wholeness, be tightened with more and more kind of, you know, like draconian and at some points hilarious, like banning emojis. It reminded me of like one hopeful thought, I guess, is I met with a friend who is a design activist in Amsterdam, and he was talking about how he is working now with community groups to build their own servers. And he feels like this is the response that we as communities who are fighting against censorship and fighting against the monetization of our bodies against our will, and the censoring of our monetization of our bodies by our own volition, that if the what we need to do is actually to take the servers into our own hands.
That's a really interesting thought. Yeah.
But then it's building a platform from the ground up too. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, again, the community, there's just so much ingenuity. Not to say that, you know, that is an easy, you know, that it's assumed that it's easy to build a platform from the ground up, but that folks are thinking about carving out space at that level as well, just as we carve out space in real life to safely do the work that we do, to carve out space in the digital realm, safe space in the digital realm. I'd like to take, if nobody else has anything to share, I'd like to take some questions from the audience. I'm just gonna check our chat and see if anyone has any questions that come up.
Wait, there's an audience?
There is, on Zoom, there's an audience. We have a robust audience, I think of 35 people or so. Yeah. Nothing so far, but I'll keep my eye out on the chat. Yes.
In the meanwhile, while we wait for questions, I did want to bounce off of that last question in that, like when we talk about this appropriation of our work and, you know, the impact of the very selective censorship that happens online, I think it's also understanding for people the very immediate financial repercussions that that has on the most marginalized people within our communities. And the reason why, especially when we're talking about sex work within this context, is like me as a drag performer and like drag-less performer, my Instagram being shut down has immediate financial repercussions for myself. But I have other avenues I can work in, and I have other protections and privileges within my work, literally just because of the fact that I'm not a sex worker. And the stigma, the very fucked up stigma that comes with that. And so then when it comes to seeing the way that sex workers have already been impacted just within the past week, the fact that this is happening in a way that quite literally could mean that they don't have rent at the end of the week, that they don't have food this week, the way that celebrity, you know, coming into these spaces, we saw the incident with Bella Thorne, the way that that immediately caused new regulation, and that sex workers within days weren't able to have access to the funds that they had worked for. I think that it's understanding, like, yes, in some circumstances, you know, it's censoring what we say and whatnot, but understanding the root of it and understanding the actual violence that lives within those laws and the goals that those laws have to eradicate the presence of sex workers, to eradicate the presence of queer people, and specifically like Black and Indigenous bodies and people and voices, I think is very strategic. I think seeing the selective way in which bodies are censored, there are a lot of disabled creators that constantly get taken down for trying to empower themselves. And, you know, this idea of appropriating marginalized people's cultures and worlds and works, like, is nothing new. It's just incredibly fucked up. And when I see it, I'm like, listen, if you're, for myself as someone who works within art that is centered around activism, I'm very strict with myself in that if I'm going to speak on something, it has to be something that I actively fight for in my life. And I think that quite often when we see celebrity and when we see social media, it's so easy for them to like make a hashtag, but also a reminder to any one of us, it's very easy for any one of us to make a hashtag or make a post and then not fight for it outside of that and not fight for it outside of performance. And to remember that, like, knowing and understanding those actual immediate life repercussions and working to understand where we get our news from as well. And that a lot of these laws, for example, the article about Pornhub that was published in the New York Times spoke about, you know, why it was so important and big that this needed to be shut down, and then immediately MasterCard and Visa removed their ability to work on those sites. But understanding the actual stats behind that and looking at sex workers that are specialized on speaking on those subjects is a very different conversation. And so I think that working on dismantling that whorephobia within ourselves, as well as working to actively fight against it socially and knowing that that appropriation causes for people to lose their lives, is incredibly important.
Yeah,
Could I chime
definitely.
in as well?
Mm.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead, Mikiki.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that I have also, thank you, Geiji, is amazing. One of the things that this also makes me think of too is like, yes, I feel like the work that I make as an artist is also about trying to, you know, to create new cultural values and to try and restory, you know, events and or narratives that are pervasive or exist that are harmful to communities of people that I care about. and that I belong to, and that is one step of the process of engaging with an issue. There are lots of other steps, and that can include boycotting companies. That can include, like just being conscious of, I don't understand why we are using Amazon still. Like, I don't understand why that is necessary. I don't think that it is necessary for us. And I'm not going to shame folks that are doing it or that have to do it or feel that, like there's lots of other alternatives for folks to use. And there's also lots of other ways that we can, manifest our activism as well. And that can be like calling your MP. It can be calling your city councillor. It can be talking to your, like conservative auntie who actually really likes you when you have green hair and you feel like you got an in, to talk about, like how she's voting or who she might want to, like, or who she could talk to about these issues. Like, there are ways that we can actually affect change, in addition to the work that we do on the stage of shifting people's opinions.
Yeah, definitely there is work outside of, as an extension of, that can definitely support the work that folks are doing, that is being banned by various different platforms. And, I think that when we talk about taking steps that financially restrict folks from being able to like produce an autonomous financial stream, it's a high stakes game. It's an incredibly high stakes game, and it is a matter of life, for many of these folks who will be affected by the various censorship protocols that are being put in place. Do have a few questions from our audience, folks, for everyone. So there are two questions, one from Cleo Tantra and one from Nick Wright. They are similar, so I'll read them out together. This is directed to everyone on the panel. Does anyone have any thoughts on whether or how we could organize around and push back on appropriation or censorship, and what we would need to do that? Where is somewhere online that is a safe space? Reddit kind of feels like a void. OnlyFans, IG, Tumblr aren't an option where we can go right now. Do folks on the panel have any insights or responses? I know we spoke about censorship and appropriation, but is there a specific platform that can identify as a safe space for the people who may be shadow banned or censored in spaces like IG or Reddit?
I do know that Twitter is less restrictive in terms of the kind of content that you're allowed to post. So you can post like fully explicit like pornographic content on Twitter. It's obviously not going to be a perfect platform. It's obviously going to have a lot of the same pitfalls that we've had with the other platforms that we mentioned. It could potentially also run the same issue, especially since like they've caught. I know that it originally started as a platform where I think they like prided themselves on like being like washing their hands of everything, and it was like, you can come use our platform and say whatever you want and do whatever you want, and they ran into trouble, obviously, especially a few years ago. So they've been a little bit more. I feel like they've been getting a little bit more flack and implementing different policies on actually having like structures set forth as to like monitoring content. But as of now, you can post explicitly pornographic or sexual content on their platform. I don't really know of any other platforms, and like as to like the safety of those platforms. I know that Mikiki was talking about building your own platforms from the ground up. Therefore, you have more autonomy over what you can do with that platform. But there are pitfalls to that too, is that like not everyone can do that. Even if you do that, it's kind of like, as I said earlier, where, if, we're kind of scattering into these different alleyways of, the internet, it's harder to get your work out there. Whereas like the great thing about like having platforms like Instagram, where it's like public platform, you can, attach yourself to a hashtag. Someone can easily find your content, share it if they have an audience. Like there's that kind of like symbiotic thing that happens there. So I don't know. I mean, there's no real good answer.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that even the platforms that are carved out for this kind of work are under attack a little bit. It's interesting to note that, even a place like Pornhub, that that the credit card companies would pull out. I mean, this far into Pornhub being a thing, it feels incredibly timely in a sense, that the community would have to shift online and that the online space would become so censored. Yeah. We'd like to, I have another question from the audience. This one's from Ander Gates. It asks, curious on thoughts on getting more known as a performer and feeling pressure to conform to more mainstream audience versus choosing to remain smaller and more niche within our queer community, or does that binary need to exist?
I don't believe in binaries. I think maybe, but it's, yeah, I think it's not, for me, it's not about like compromising or even thinking that there has to be some kind of compromise around becoming mainstream or something like that. I think that at the end it goes back to, if you put out there and if you do what is most honestly, authentically yours, if you're constantly challenging yourself, if you're putting your full weirdness out there, then like you're carving out space for yourself. I mean, we all have to carve ourselves. I don't think that even the idea of mainstream, it shifts. That's why like things get co-opted, things can change for the better and at the same time for the worse. It's kind of like everything is this relationship, right? Things are, it's like I think about, and I get pretty esoteric all the time. That's what I do, but like the universe is constantly expanding, right? So we are liberating ourselves in our bodies and our minds. So the more that we liberate ourselves, there's that other like side of it where the conservatives, the Republicans, that they're just getting more and more and more into their own bullshit, right? So then everything carries that. There's that relationship. So I think it's really just, it's about that fearlessness, and not to say that, oh, it's so easy. It's because I'm constantly afraid of everything, and even if I have anything to say, like, is it valuable? Like, why am I doing it? And even if I have to go back to, well, solipsism and nothing else exists and it's just me, well, I'm still doing what I'm doing, and I would still do it the same if this is some kind of projection reality or not. Just as long as I know that with myself, I like what I do. It challenges me, and I know why I'm doing it. And even if I may not have a specific, like just a very clear answer for myself, like I'll still ask myself the questions and do it. That's what I like recommend. Like I don't think that if you're thinking about a specific, building a specific like level of an audience, like that's kind of, those things just happen, right? You have to, there's different energy that you got to start building up on to build a foundation where you are solid in yourself, and then everything else.
Hmm. Sorry, Lord, can you just repeat that last line you said? I feel like you cut out.
Oh, what was I saying about building a solid foundation? So yeah, like starting it from like the innermost, like your, and going from there, everything starts coming
Thank you. This question is also by Ander Gates. They ask, what are your thoughts about video and online versions of performances engaging in some, what are your thoughts about video online versions of performances can be engaging in a similar way to in-person performances? Can they be as engaging as in-person performances? And what would make them as engaging?
Is it okay if I go back to the last question for a sec? I feel like that
Sure.
there's just something that I wanted to chime in with before we move forward. I don't have any false sense of ambition or like a false sense of reality. I'm 42 years old. I do drugs. I'm public about that. I'm living with HIV. I do work that is not like do work for queer people. I do work for queer weird people. I do work for my positive brothers and sisters and siblings. Like I'm not in it to be the next like Justin Lance Bass or whatever, like, or Lance Black. Like, I don't even know the celebrity, like the gay celebrities. Like, I don't even know their names. I do not care about that. I'm not interested in participating in that economy. I want to be able to use the platforms that exist, or I want there to be platforms that exist that allow me to connect with other people who similarly identify. Sure, I would like my work to be seen by more people. That would be great. I'm not interested in becoming mainstream. I'm not interested in my work being seen even by my parents. I tell them specifically, this is a work that you can see. This is a work you are probably not going to want to see. I'm not interested in changing their minds because I'm speaking to a specific community and they're not a part of it.
That's incredibly poignant. I'm glad you said that, Mikiki. And you know your audience. Oftentimes as a creator, as a performer, you have an intended audience in mind, and you're creating as a call out, as a to that specific audience. And yeah, I think that it's interesting to think about mainstream, because certainly there are people within the realm of cabaret and burlesque that are considered more mainstream. They don't necessarily shift what's happening, in the underground or in the communities themselves. They sort of, they're sort of external of that in some ways.
Absolutely. And, like as Dorian Corey said, like you shoot an arrow and it flies real high, hooray for you. Like I have a different target.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I also think if you are an artist who has the opportunity, if you're an artist who is born into privilege, you have more of an you've more of an opportunity, and I would say I'm going to challenge anyone who has more privilege to take bigger risks. Like big risk, like the ones that you're like, for this individual, and there's like, if you've been sitting on ideas or thoughts or things that you have cravings for, dive into it, especially if you, and I don't know who this person is, but especially if you come from privilege, you have a greater opportunity to take a bigger risk. Even though all of us constantly take risks for our specific communities or our practices, what have you. And then And then in answering the second question, I look at videos as like an opportunity to be my own pop star without needing to be famous. I don't care about that either. But like I have an opportunity to be like, wow, I get to make a piece that could be like my own music video for storytelling. And that's how I've been trying to approach virtual live performance or pre-recorded virtual performance. I'm like, great, now I have to learn another thing. And all of that accessibility that I've had to navigate with, as I now have a tripod and 2 lights that I didn't have before the pandemic. But I think there's a greater opportunity to explore, and also when we are able to gather in spaces together again, I'm so excited to see how art will have changed for cabaret performers who have navigated this, because now we will all be coming back together, hopefully with some more experiences that have allowed us to thrive.
Yeah, I think that, again, the ingenuity and the innovation that has come out of community, even on an individual level, of the kind of creativity that folks have put into creating content online, either live or pre-recorded, has been exceptional. Like, I never knew that you were a burlesque performer / music video producer, but now you are. And it's kind of incredible that, as I said, there was a very little, there was a very short radio silence on the part of cabaret community, and then folks started being incredibly creative about how they could continue doing the work that they were doing. And really watching folks take on that new role of media artist has been equally as exciting. Because again, I feel like there are oftentimes lines drawn between, things like performance art, fine art, media art, design, theater, and the mashup that happens out of sheer necessity generates a kind of creativity that, we may not have experienced under, different circumstances, or if things had remained pre-COVID or so on. It's interesting to see the new work that's being created by cabaret community. So we've just got a few minutes left. I'm wondering if anyone has some final words or ideas they want to share about, what they think of the future of queer cabaret. Prior to COVID, we had a number of festivals circulating the circuit. We had a number of venues that were carving out space specifically for QT BIPOC cabaret. How do you feel about the future of cabaret in this digital IRL mashup version that we're experiencing?
I can go first. It's like a very weird place to start, but my brain is just like, I don't particularly care, to be honest with you, in terms of, like, my brain is not in a place where it's concerned about industry. My brain is in a place where it's concerned about like whether or not we will have community to then have an industry at all. I think that right now I witnessed a lot of, like, even in regards to the last questions as well, like when we talk about online, I think it's brought in a whole load of new forms of accessibility for people that they didn't have before. But I think also because it is online, because it does require new materials, it also brought a level of inaccessibility that is also present. And I think that understanding that our world isn't as simple as like privilege is not privilege in all regards. Like when we talk about sex work, like we have burlesque performers that are sex workers. We have burlesque performers that are super, super privileged and not privileged. And like that exists across all forms of cabaret performance. And so when it comes to like, what is the future of it? I'm like, well, if it's only going to be the most privileged parts of our community that survive, like, I don't care, because it means I lost all, like my siblings and I are gone. Right. And so I think that as queer people, I think that as artists, art is always going to exist. And what I invite people to do, especially now, is to create the art that you would make in your ideal world that you would want to build anyway. And just make that. I think life is incredibly short. And that when I think of my loved ones and what I would miss if they were gone, I think that we often forget to attribute that to ourselves and remember how important our voice as individual and how important our lives.
Thank you for that.
I feel similarly to, like, in a way, yeah, now we're at a point where it's an end and it's a beginning and a beginning and an end. And yeah, it'll be curious to see where cabaret goes, where performance art, where live events go, and all of this. At the same time, something that I think about is, well, not only have we not had the internet forever, but we're not gonna have it forever. And just like thinking about like the tangible underwater cables that carry the internet, and the damage that causes to the ecosystem, but also the risks of it falling apart. And like, for minute, there's so many points at which it can all go wrong. And I know it's like, ooh, sad. Yeah, but that's just the thing, right? It will, I like our Lord Jesus was saying, I am concerned about the people, like our family, our kin, and I don't mean just the human ones, right? It's all of our kin. Like I'm concerned for all of us. That's and we everything. Our existence is art already. Our existence is all of those things, and so as long as we are existing, art will continue to be alive, and is what's continue to keep us alive. It's all gonna keep shifting. Hopefully I'm here until I'm 100. I don't know. But even if gone sooner than that, it just, as long as we're making the kind of fucking work that we want to do, that's all we can do.
Thank you. Definitely our kinship with all living things is implicated in all of our actions.
I'm hoping that we can start resonating together for a call to destruction. I'm really interested in seeing the fucking, capitalist machine fall apart very soon, so that there is less collateral damage to the people who are going to be the most impacted by it, which are those of us that are marginalized to begin with. We have seen this incredible surge of mutual aid and community solidarity, and like looking out for each other and reaching out to look out for each other through this pandemic. And that's been such a glowing light through this, like, otherwise like the world is not looking pretty cute these days, like she came out with the paint all wrong, and this machine that we have is not working. And I think more and more of us are realizing it, and as performers, I think hopefully we can start creating a harmonic that brings people to a place of not just resistance, but also of like of active destruction of the forces that are keeping our communities down. And I wanted to add a tiny, maybe a friendly amendment or suggestion to the comment that Tygr Willy brought up earlier about performers with more privilege taking more risks, because I think that's so important. And I also, it makes me think of Lady Gaga with the wearing the meat dress and not giving any nod to like Jana Sturback, you know, who was the actual originator of the meat dress. Didn't, you know, that there are so many artists that especially when they have a mainstream stylistic team, will take from communities and take from cultures and take from other artists that don't have, like we just saw Balenciaga got called out for stealing this Belgian Vietnamese, I think, fashion designers like last collection. You know, like we see that as you have more privilege, you historically you've been able to just take from other people and not have to acknowledge it. So taking a risk, but make it your own fucking risk.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, as we wrap up, I'd like to thank all of our artists for joining us in this conversation. You're amazing, and I can't wait to see your work in the showcases that are coming up. Thank you to our wonderful ASL interpreters, Tala Jalili and Q. Big thank you to our broadcasting tech, David Blackmore. I'd like to thank Aluna Theatre for hosting the Push-Pull speaker series and workshops. I'd also like to thank Buddies in Bad Times Theatre and Fado Performance Arts Center for supporting us in various ways. Finally, this series would not be possible without the funding of the Canada Council for the Arts. And it wouldn't be possible without our wonderful audience. Thank you to everyone who joined us for Gender Bender. Stay tuned for more push-pull programming in the new year, including other speaker series, workshops, and wonderful showcase performances for our lovely, lovely artists. Thank you again, and have a good night, everyone.
Y'all are beautiful.